All right. So with that, we are now live on Facebook. Hello, everyone. You're here with me, Lucas Schaefer, the mending coordinator at KSAC, and I'm also here with Warren. Warren, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi, I'm Warren Moore. I'm a philosophy student at Trent University and also a KSAC MENding co-facilitator as of almost a year now that I've been. Yeah, like 9 months.
Yeah, it's been a while. So thanks for coming on to chat with us with a mending check-in. We've been doing these weekly for the summer. Yeah, I'm super excited to have you here.
Yeah.
So Warren, if you're able to tell us, how'd you get involved with the mending program?
This would be a story that you're a bit familiar with. It was you who introduced me. I think it was a little bit on a whim. It was, I think, the day before one of the cohorts started. You pitched it to me, and I had nothing else to do that day, and it sounded very interesting. Like, I think I had sort of, what was it? You kind of introduced me to what mending is and what KSAC was, and I think what sort of stuck out to me right away was like, being a guy in the 21st century, it's always like, you always like hear the phrases, oh, it's time for a conversation about gender-based violence, it's time for a conversation about misogyny, but like, it's not like I had ever really sat down and had a conversation. So I just thought, hey, I have the time and this is something that sounds very interesting and very important. So I thought, why not? And now here I am.
So you mentioned before that you were a philosophy student, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think I gave you this kind of like mending program pitch while we were at a philosophy symposium. Is that correct?
Yeah, it was. Yeah.
So like, I was super excited to talk to you about mending and talk about the program because I think like you and I come to this issue and talk about gender-based violence and men's role in like ending gender-based violence from a very like similar place, right? Like,
oh yeah, for sure.
There's many ways to talk about this, and I think like, how do you think philosophy kind of like plays into how we can frame and interact with like ending gender-based violence? I know it's a huge big picture question, but like, so I'll rephrase it. How do you think like your philosophy background has helped you understand gender-based violence?
Yeah, that is a big question.
Yeah,
but I think a big part of it is a lot of what, you can, it's a broad question, but like what a lot of philosophy has sort of dealt with is like the kind of cultural narratives we have almost. And sometimes it will be towards creating a cultural narrative, and other times it will be towards critiquing them. And I think like currently, a lot of places in contemporary philosophies are critiquing how they come about, not necessarily positive or negative, but just sort of exploring them. So like, I think there is like a certain degree that was just sort of like, I think philosophy helps take like a step back to see where these kind of narratives come from about like how we understand the world, or how we understand, for instance, misogyny or masculinity or all sorts of these topics. Like where these ideas, where like our ideas came from and how we find new ways to think about them is kind of where I approach it from. But
yeah, no,
it is a very broad.
It is, yeah, like definitely. Thank you so much for that answer. So what was another kind of like standout moment in the mending program? What was something that you took from it, or like a kind of experience while you were doing that cohort?
I think the biggest sort of takeaway, like the thing I remember the most is like a lot of the activities were very interesting for sure. Like those were definitely takeaways, but I think overall like the most memorable thing would just kind of just the conversations, like just having a place that it's, like as much as they are serious issues and whatnot, and like they affect, friendships and everything in our lives, it's not really something you kind of get that many opportunities just like to directly talk about. Like
Yeah.
even though I'm sort of the kind of, as a philosophy student, kind of the person to have those conversations a lot, it's sort of like the direct conversation of, men's roles in gender-based violence, in ending gender-based violence, and all those, and like male roles in society overall, like just sitting down to talk about that is just in itself was memorable because it's, talking, it was sort of, I talked to you a fair bit, I talked to the other mending facilitators, and I talked to um, the other students who were taking the program. So I think just like the different points of view and just having the opportunity to like kind of understand things better by talking to people and like, getting more points of view that just isn't, it isn't something that you get to do very much and about that kind of sensitive topic.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. Like, that's definitely like a sentiment we've been hearing with like the previous mending check-ins, right? People really appreciate the authenticity
Yeah.
that's like present in these conversations, right? Because like we're going in there and we're discussing something that we all need to like and all have like not talked about, right? And
Mm-hmm.
like these kind of conversations you can't have alone. You can't just
Yeah.
like cognate sitting in a chair and think about like how to
Yeah.
solve this, right? Like this is something that you have to talk about with other men. So yeah, thank you so much for that. You're talking about different activities. Was there like an activity that you think was like kind of your favorite or one that you really liked?
Oh man.
There's a lot.
Yeah, there's a lot. I think I can't say I'm not sure I'd say really liked like it was a but more of just like most impactful, I think, was we did the activity of looking at news stories, because then you could kind of get the takeaway of, looking at how people are writing about it. Like you can see sort of, how the perspective people wrote from kind of could be very warped in a way, like the kind of, like some of the writings were better than others, but some of them were like, it was blatant. They were talking about something horrible that happened, but it was framed in a way that was like reducing what happened, or I don't know. I just remember it. I wouldn't say it was like my favorite, as in like I loved it. It was a great time. I'd say as in like very impactful and like very, in a way, angering, but I think good overall. Like finding something to like kind of very helpful in like understanding how like I'm trying to remember, there was one that was basically about a sexual harassment case, and it was like the way it could be framed that it was so toned down and like almost a talking about the perpetrator as if this was just, oh, the great guy won all these awards and then oops, he had an oops and ruined somebody's life kind of thing.
Yeah, totally, right? And like I thank you so much for mentioning that because it's super important how these news articles are like framing these issues, right? When
Yeah.
people's like perpetrators' accolades are mentioned before or in like replacement of the
Yeah.
actual content of like why the article's being written, we're asking ourselves like why that is, right? Like
Yeah.
why
Yeah.
is this article deliberately framing this issue to relieve this person of being like accountable, right? And you
Yeah.
also mentioned something, right, that we often hear, which is that like the idea that like their behavior is impacting their life or like ruining their life, right?
Mm-hmm.
And like this person is a value pillar in our community, but
Yeah.
oops, right? When in reality, right, it's bringing truth to the fact that it's correcting their character and their public like persona, right? Like this is by telling everyone about like what has happened, like if in this case that you were talking about sexual harassment, that is a correction. That's not like ruining anything. It's making the understanding of that person in like the public sphere more.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, thank you so much for that. Is there another kind of like point that was like super impactful in the program?
um I think in terms of the activities or just overall?
Let's go with activities. Yeah.
Yeah.
Keep going with
Okay.
activities.
I think some of it was in terms of I think the bystander intervention parts come to mind because it's sort of a lot of it was like, kind of the shock situations that are kind of unfortunately kind of things most people have to deal with it pretty much, like either directly or something that you'll hear about. But I think it was sort of the ability to like step back and look at like a dramatization of an assault, harassment, etc., and then being able to kind of think about, okay, what is the best kind of course of action to take? Because I think, I had come to MENding having already from university heard about so many different instances where it was either a friend or a friend of a friend who had dealt with sexual harassment, assault, etc. And it just kind of like it's almost like a hopeless feeling where you just sort of get angry, and it's like only after the fact that you start to think, oh, what is the thing to do? And it's so like in that sense, the thing about it, being able to like talk about those situations, like again, like I kind of brought it back to at the beginning, was what the biggest takeaway was. Having the conversation was being able to like realize that it's like not, a worry that is you're alone with, or like something you have to, like you said, it's not something you can really solve in your mind.
Yeah.
Like it's something you have to kind of discuss with people and like, what is the appropriate way to deal with these things? And I think that was sort of my takeaway from the bystander intervention was, being able to like take a step back and like think about this serious issue without sort of in advance.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that, Warren. Like, I want to doubly emphasize something that you mentioned, right? Like, when we look at the recent like student voice survey that happened at Trent and Fleming University, like I don't have the exact statistics, so I don't want to like misinform everyone, but like it's way more than what is acceptable, right? Like like it's ridiculous how many people either directly experience like sexual harassment or like sexual violence, or people who indirectly do it, or excuse me, like indirectly face it. So like as you were talking about, like knowing someone who's gone through it, or even like witnessing it, right? So like when people are witnessing these things and they're asking themselves, what can I do to intervene? How can I make it so that like less harm is happening, right? Bystander intervention and teaching those strategies and those approaches and attitudes are super crucial, right? And something that kind of, oh gosh, it's a huge conversation, right? Because I also really sympathize with what you were talking about before when like we're talking about the prevalence of gender-based sexual violence on campuses, that sometimes we can feel hopeless, right? It feels like we can't stop it or interact it, right? But like we definitely can. But it takes everybody working together. It's a multifaceted thing, right? Because it's not all going to be focused on prevention. It's also going to be focused on support. And yeah, so it's a whole thing, and I'm super glad that you're on board and helping end it. Thank you. Yeah. All right. Are there any other kind of like points you want to talk about? Impactful points from the MENding program?
Overall, I'd say, like, I think that one of the bigger takeaways was like, for instance, something that was done in kind of in the conversations overall, it's like a recurring thing in MENding was sort of like how we kind of build up cultural narratives towards like what we think is like the masculine role in society versus feminine roles in society, and those kind of, how we build up those images. And like that's always, in terms of being a philosophy student, something that's always been interesting. And I think it's always was also a great takeaway from MENding was like, especially from different perspectives and like people's different backgrounds, you can sort of find out how similar but different ways those kind of narratives are built up. It's definitely a very interesting takeaway, I think.
Yeah, like when you're talking about that, you're talking about the social construction of gender. Like that's a super philosophical concept. Yeah, like and that's only like one way to look at it, right? Because if you, I don't know, for instance, come from like a media background, you could see how like representations of like masculinity, things like in movies, television shows, social media, like it's incredible like how many perspectives you can take to these issues and how much information you can get out of that. Yeah.
And I think it was like, it was something that was on my mind through like high school or as a teenager, a lot in Trent before I came to MENding, but it was like just having that ability to like, the space to talk about it, and all of that was just great, I found. And I think, I think there's with, I think outside of MENding, even it is like an integral conversation to have, like especially with almost more so now that it's a little bit more difficult to kind of have those conversations when everything's like through coronavirus and all that.
Yeah. So why do you think it's more difficult to have conversations about what it means to be a man during coronavirus times?
Like I think, being distant from everybody is kind of a deal with that. Like I think everything's filtered through the internet right now, and that is sort of one of my areas of interest in philosophy, is like how technology has changed how we talk about things, or the new spaces emerging to talk about things. And I don't think the internet has been the most healthy space for talking about gender norms.
Sorry, I can't help but laugh. Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. Yeah, like I do think there are just some spaces of the internet where where like conversations about what it means to be a man, and even just like mentioning gender, like it's just kind of frowned upon or tossed aside, right? Like people don't take these conversations about themselves like with any degree of seriousness. It's really disappointing, but yeah. But I do think there are like great areas of the internet. Like, do you know of any like cool spots where like good conversations kind of like are having? Yeah.
Like I think that's sort of the upside and the downside of the internet is, in terms of, I'm trying to remember like the actual statistics, but like in terms of the actual percent of people who are like actively making content for the internet, like constantly making YouTube videos, blog posts, etc., Facebook content, is a very small sliver, and it tends to be people with like, like it tends to be a great place for views that you won't normally hear offline so much, for better or worse. And like I think the better end is like we've seen like the emergence of a lot of online spaces built around like the conversation of gender in a positive way, like around transgender rights, or I think the LGBT community especially, like there's been lots of spaces like since the internet started up that have been kind of the spaces to have these conversations where it would be unsafe to have those conversations in like your real world community for a lot of people. In terms of specific ones, it's I would like, I'm trying to have this conversation, but like I've been a bit distant from it. I've been trying to put some distance with coronavirus, try not to get a bit too far off from the internet. So I'm trying to think. Or you can think of?
Yeah, like I'm sure there's like as you were talking about like different like YouTubers or different like moderated spaces, right? Like where there's kind of like guidelines or like kind of like TOSs, right? Where like you can participate in this space as long as like you don't propagate hate speech or elements like that, right? I really liked what you mentioned too, right? Because like what we were talking about before, like there are sometimes the internet can be terrible for people,
boy.
marginalized people. But also, you also mentioned that like it can be great. People can start having conversations and feel safe when they otherwise might not, right? Like I think it's this wonderful and terrible double-edged sword. The internet is. Yeah. So yeah, depends on like how the space is moderated, and I think moderation is like super important to create those safe places. Yeah.
I kind of remember, I've always had, in my personal perspective, I've always been kind of a little, whatchamacallit, at a bit of a distance. Like when I hear kind of like a lot of the time on the internet will be like the very, stereotypical, very patriarchal standards of gender you can see in some spaces where it'll be like, oh, this is the man's role, conquest, etc. Like it will be very, like there's the, I think, like there's a lot of the spaces like I think like one of them is like tends to call itself the red pill, where it's all about like reclaiming masculinity and all that. Like I've always felt very distant from that. Like I think part of it was, personally, I never in like high school, I just happened to have like this period where I didn't have the most guy friends. Like I didn't have those sorts of weird interactions in real life, so it just felt so alien when there are people like, don't you feel like you've lost your masculinity from the decline of civilization? And it's like, what are you talking about? But on the other hand, like, it's one thing to sort of mock those conversations, but another thing like I always try to keep in mind is like, it's just certain circumstances shift away from like, as a young white man who's on the internet a lot, the prime demographic for being hit by that sort of thing. So like I always try and like keep in mind, like how many steps away could I have been from like having a few bad days and being more heavily influenced that than having a kind of few steps back that I can look at it like that.
I think that's such like thank you so much. I think that's like such a healthy way of viewing that too, right? Because like as much as we can laugh at like the like just like mysticism and like weird moon logic that people apply to things, like the reason why there's a feminization of men happening is because there's a decline of civilization, morals are going down. But like I think you had a super like just like truthful take is that like people are products of their circumstances, right? Like the reason why us as cis white men are like primed to fall into those kinds of like behaviors and thoughts is just because like when we feel like disenfranchised or disempowered, right? Like when we are in vulnerable states, like mental health and mental illness wise, right? Like we're susceptible to these ideas that we don't have to like blame ourselves for our actions. We can blame others, right? It's not because I'm not confident or like it's not because of like some personal failure. It's because other people are bad or on decline or something like that, right? It's projecting at its finest, but like it can happen to anyone, right? So it's important to understand these perspectives and like always be ready to reach out to the people who are falling victim to it is how I would kind of like conceive of it. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I would say for sure, like I think I've done sort of by myself a fair bit of reading around like the topics of extremism and things like that. And like what always sort of strikes me is like when you hear about like brainwashing or cults or all this, like the perspective we tend to take is like, oh, it's how could anyone ever believe X or how could anybody fall into that? But like what you find time and time again is you're not dealing with, dumb people almost like or even like very gullible people. You're dealing with people who are just like me and you, or people who oftentimes are more intelligent than I am, who kind of the wrong things happened at the wrong time and end up, finding themselves in an extreme place. And like, when you're talking about like extremism, that can mean, that can mean they end up a horrible person by virtue of their actions, but how they got there, you can't, like, I don't think it's ever healthy to treat it as like completely alien, like when it is oftentimes people very similar to us. Like, here's like one thing I can try to remember to recommend was there was a brief podcast done by the New York Times called Rabbit Hole, I believe it was, where the first, not the whole thing, but the first few episodes were following a young man. I think he was 23 now, so like a bit older than me, but anyways, it was like how he sort of realized he was in kind of the same internet circles talking about like the red pill and masculinity as as a guy who went on, I think he was the he was like realizing he was absorbing all the same narratives as the New Zealand shooter who had like all of these extreme beliefs, and like he had just sort of it was kind of it details like his journey down where, he was sort of pretty bright when he was in high school. He was very bright in high school, university, but he just ended up in the situation where he was out of work, in an environment he didn't have many friends, and kind of not the best relationship with his family. And like the result of that was he was stuck with, a lot of time to be on the internet listening to, at first, self-help content that started to take on this very misogynistic tone over time, that he just started to, it being what he listened to day in, day out, when he, like during this rough patch in his life, kind of led it down this path where like that's what seemed reasonable, like wholeheartedly, because that was like the most empathetic voice was what podcasts and YouTube he was listening to, even though it was extreme what like going from where we are listening to would be like the kind of decline of masculinity talk where it just seems so, what are you talking about? But when you're in that space, it seems appealing because it's reaching out very empathetically, how these sorts of ideologies and groups can kind of motivate people down these terrible paths.
Mm-hmm. Just to clarify, just for myself, are you talking about the Christchurch shooting?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, like that. That act was absolutely horrific, right?
Oh yeah.
There's so many things that we could talk about, and I think you were absolutely right to talk about like the YouTubers that this person had like watched and listened to in these vulnerable moments, right? Because they, this person who like committed this act, called those YouTubers out by name in the live video that he.
And like he referenced different like very extreme YouTubers in his manifesto and all this. Like it's very, as much as I don't think you should always take that kind of person at their exact word, it is sort of clear like where his sort of thinking mapped onto a lot of stuff that kind of finds its home on YouTube or sort of the margins, or sometimes not even that margin of social media and the internet. And it's,
I have a question for you then.
Yeah.
So, if like, as we're talking about, people are super vulnerable when they're feeling like isolated, when they feel like people are understanding them, to like reach out to these people who are who they are believing like they're forming a connection with. Do you think it is like in those kind of like YouTubers, bloggers, like social media personalities' responsibility to like be responsible for the kind of content that they're making then?
I mean, yeah, for sure, kind of.
Yeah. So I didn't mean to make that question.
It's like it's a difficult conversation, like the exact, because like when you deal with the more extreme ends, you deal with like some personalities who are consciously like definitely malicious, definitely intentionally trying to like even openly talking about trying to like separate people from their families so they can like mentally separate them. I mean, like telling them like, oh, you shouldn't listen to your family, you need to find the world for yourself, by which they mean listen to more of me on YouTube or my podcast or this not so sketchy website or whatever. But to like the lesser end, I think it's sort of a difficult line to draw, and like
I hear that. I respect.
I know to some extent there is some extent that the sort of Silicon Valley companies are trying to address it, to which I'm kind of a bit of a cynic when it comes to places like Facebook addressing it, because at the end of the day, it's sort of money is the name of the game in terms of if it's popular on YouTube, Facebook, or whatever, it might draw ad revenue. And so that will be like, it will take a big scandal before, which there has been in terms of Facebook. There has been lots of corporate advertising boycotts, but to like the direct responsibility of certain like YouTube personalities, I think it's hard to say, but like there's, you know, varies by case to case, but like there's definitely a responsibility of who's putting out content on YouTube to like take responsibility for what they have when you get to millions and millions of subscribers, to make sure, you know, that like there's a lot of conversations around parasocial relationships, like the relationship somebody can have to a celebrity, and like how YouTube really amplifies this, because a lot of YouTubers tend to take on like the personality of like, hey, it's me, your friend, the friendliest guy on YouTube. Let's play video games, or watch me play video games rather. And like I think there's a definitely a responsibility to, when you have that relationship with millions of people where you don't really have a relationship with them, they have a relationship with the person making YouTube content, making sure they're not sending out toxic messages or building up those kind of ideological echo chambers where it's like, yeah.
Like, thank you so much. You answered that question like to the exact like way I was like hoping, right? Because like there's so many ways we can conceptualize what responsibility looks like for these figures, right? And I think you hit the two. I think you hit recognizing the kind of relationship you have with your community, and then a responsibility to like have like some sort of like say in your community, right? Like you shouldn't just like go, oh, it's a free for all, right? Whoever watches my content is watching my content because all I care about is the big bucks, right? Like so like it's gonna like distinguish between people who are looking to just say and do whatever's gonna get them more like viewers and more followers, with like people who like genuinely care about like the kind of community that they're creating, right? Like we were saying before, right? Like if you say, hey, I disavow people who are misogynist in my community. Like I want to curate the kind of like spaces that people are going to feel comfortable and safe, and I want those people to watch my content, right? Like so that's what I think responsibility can look like in in the internet age. Thank you so much. All right. Are there any other points that you want to hit? Any impactful moments from the MENding program, or anything in general?
I think we've hit a lot of heavy points. Some that we've gone over. I think one of the takeaways, like I sort of mentioned, it's like on the one hand, it's you know, making sure when we have these sort of a few step back conversations to like never feel like too, like realizing that like a lot of the people who find themselves in like these very toxic places aren't always that far from us. I think the other like angle of that is, you know, to like anybody listening or watching, if you have in the past found yourself like down those sorts of rabbit holes of like very toxic thinking, it's like, you know, not alone. And it's like, unless you've done something bad, it's not something to feel like monster for, because it's like something you can get past. And like I think especially in terms of philosophy and like looking at history, it's like a long, like in terms of the kind of, you know, like the big narrative going around a lot in that, like, you know, we kind of mentioned was always like you have to reclaim masculinity, like it's something that's been lost. I think what's always stuck out to me in philosophy and like in reading historic texts is like there's always this narrative of reclaiming. Like there was never a point where somebody said, yep, masculinity, like, yes, the strong man this is the great time to be a strong man. It's always like right now, there's like a lot of conversations of like, it's always weird because you hear lots of conversations of, oh, men aren't manly now. Well, remember the time we had a war, and it's like that was a horrible thing to refer to, but also there's still lots of war, and it's like, but you know, it's like I'm looking back to, I think I remember this from my MENding cohort was like talking about the Boy Scouts, how like a lot of the founding of the Boy Scouts was the idea of, you know, this was centuries back, and like the founding ideology was sort of like we need to reclaim masculinity and make these boys into men. And like that's sort of the time we think of right now as when there was, like the traditional masculinity. And like the framework the Boy Scouts were built around was, when was there masculinity? Oh, back in the cowboy days. And it's like, you look at the cowboy days and there were news articles complaining about the cowboys being too feminine because they were going on labor strike and like, they should just suck up kind of thing. And like you look back and there's always just, oh man, used to be so great. There was like never it's just like this secular loop of like referring to like this ideal of strong masculine men. So like it's just to keep in mind, it's like, you know, it's not a big statement, like horrible to like not something to feel bad about getting sucked into those loops. It's like something that's been constant almost.
Yeah.
And I think in that sense, like the takeaway is like what you have to do is sort of, and you know, something I think about is like how do you think about like positive masculinity? And like the thing to do is partially like looking at yourself rather than these big narratives. And the other role is like I mentioned way back was like the big takeaway was being able to have that space to talk to a bunch of guys is like talking to friends, talking to family, talking to people you care about, rather than trying to like worrying about all of these big narratives about when men used to be real men, who are the weak men, who are the strong men, is just, you know.
Wow. Thank you so much for it. That was so perfect. And I think you're totally right. Like people who are like falling into these narratives and falling into these loops of like calling back and trying to find what masculinity is in these kind of like age-old traditions that all seem to be super vapid and referring to things further and further back. It turns out that masculinity is how you decide to live your life, right? Like that's it. It's just you live your life, and as long as that's healthy for you and like not harming other people, you're doing it. That's the doing the man thing.
Great, fantastic.
Yeah, but like I really liked another point you said, and I'll ask you about it just to like emphasize it. You were talking about like don't feel bad about like. So like the message that you just said was kind of like don't feel bad about getting like falling into these kind of pitfalls, right?
Yeah.
And I think that also has something to do with like people recognizing like wrongdoing and like understanding where they've gone wrong and coming to terms with it, right? Because man, not to go down another rabbit hole, but like there have been studies about like men and like and forgiveness, right? And that men have a very, very difficult time forgiving either other people and also themselves. So it's like recognizing the wrongdoing that you've done and moving forward with that. So like, what do you think? How do we think we can like tell men and communicate to men like it's okay to do the wrong thing, and like help them? Yeah. What do you think?
Um, like I think it's, you know, sort of one of the rules that I think that makes the mending program, not to re-sub it in, it's very important, but also like those conversations, it's sort of like I think like the big takeaway is like just base empathy, like realizing like that this isn't entirely, you know, as much as like, as much damage can be caused, it's not entirely your fault. Like there's all these big narratives in society and like all these cultural narratives and all these different pushes and pulls that it's like, you know, there are reasons that you kind of fall into those sort of traps and like reasons why those sort of stories emerge. Like,
Yeah.
I think it's, yeah, like it is a tough conversation in terms of like the forgiveness angle. I think part of it is, it's tough.
Yeah, like I think you're hitting like a key point, right? That like we can look at this individually and we can talk to
Yeah,
individual people, and but we also have to understand that it's happening on a huge, broader scale, right? Like when we're
yeah,
talking about cultural trends and cultural norms, we're talking about systemic things that are like embedded in a lot of things, institutions, policies, how we live our lives. Like it's huge, right? Like, and as you
hmm,
said, and taking back to another point, like we're people of our circumstances, right? And
yeah,
there's some extent where we can control like which circumstances are like around us and affecting us directly, but a lot of it is just tough because
yeah,
because like oh gosh, it starts from day one, right?
yeah,
Like what you're being taught in schools, from your family, from
hmm,
your friends, all the way up to like now when you're like in university, or you're like in your kind of high school and post-secondary like life. It's a whole process. You're going to be wrong a lot, and that's because um, a lot
yeah.
of we can critique these like trends and stuff like that. Yeah, like it's huge. It's huge. There's many ways to look at it.
Like,
And
yeah, I don't know. It's like it's tough to like have like the answer in mind for what to do about like forgiving yourself for wrongdoing, and I think it's like even in smaller ways, it's something like that's always like, I don't know about you, but it's like something I think about. Like whenever I've think about mistakes in the past, it does nag at me for like a long time, and like even for minor things or things I think of as more heavy-handed. So like it's part of it is just, yeah, acknowledging that it's tough to kind of forgive yourself or forgive people for doing those sorts of, doing like something wrong, even if it's like not the severe end. But I think another end is just to think about is like acknowledging that like those kinds of referring to the past, referring to like stronger masculinity can be like personally harmful. Like if you think of, if you're constantly framing things in terms of, am I masculine enough? I'm not masculine enough. Am I controlling enough to my girlfriend, or all those sorts of things? It's like there's always like you know, the very blatant way it can be harmful to the people around you. But then just constantly having that kind of anxiety and kind of identity issue of like, am I acting the right way? It's like corrosive to yourself. So like I think it's tough coming to terms with, but and like it's tough forgiving yourself for like what you've done wrong in the past, but just realizing like making amends isn't the worst thing in the world. It's not as corrosive, if corrosive at all. It's not, you know, it can be tough, but it's not always like I was saying about like the conversation with MENding at all. It's like it's one thing to always like, my biggest takeaway was the tough conversations, and like that's not to say it was like a miserable time. Like it's still like a positive process overall. Like I've enjoyed my time at MENding as much as it does bring up heavy things.
yeah, thank you so much, Warren. I know that we could keep talking about this and could keep talking about how valuable these like authentic and genuine conversations that we have are. But maybe another time.
Maybe another time. We've
Yeah.
gone on for a little bit.
So with that, do you have a final message to the men that are watching or the people that are watching? What's like a kind of final statement that you want to say?
Yeah, I think sort of the, kind of through line of the thing we've talked about has been, it's a tough conversation, but at the end of the day, it's a very helpful one, like personally helpful with our relation to other people. It's like remembering that these are conversations that help us, and they help our relationship to other people and women, friends, everybody. And it's just like, I think that's sort of the biggest takeaway is having the importance of just having these conversations, and like that mending provides that kind of space where you can talk about heavy things. And it's not like, it's important to have these conversations with people in your life, but that can be really difficult. And like, I think the importance of finding, spaces like mending, if not mending itself, that you can kind of have these conversations and not be worried about saying the wrong thing, or just sort of the space to work things out. And I think like the importance of finding those kinds of spaces that you can do them, holding on to them, and like having those conversations with people you care about too. Like work things out rather than being so wrapped up in whatever narrative of masculinity you're pressured towards.
Thank you so much, Warren. And with that, we want to thank you so much for listening. This has been a Mending Check-In with Lucas and Warren, and we look forward to hearing from you in comments, and we look forward to listening in next week as well. Until then, take care. Goodbye, everyone. Bye, Warren.
Bye. So long.